There's so much photography information out there, it's overwhelming. So let's make it very simple. In 6 minutes time, you will have all the core skills you need to proudly stand up in front of your friends and say, I am a photographer. Let's not waste time in the intro, let's get good fast. As photographers, if a picture is our canvas, then light is our paint. So as a photographer, you need to learn how to control the light. The most important thing to understand here is the concept of exposure. Exposure is the amount of light reaching the sensor inside your camera. Think of your sensor like a piece of film. The more your film is exposed to light, the brighter your image will be. This image is overexposed and this one is underexposed. When we talk about light, the units are called stops. And very simply put, a stop is just doubling or halving the amount of light that your camera sees. This will make more sense very soon. There are 3 easy settings you'll need to grasp to master your exposure. And to get a correct exposure, you need to balance them. Let's start with shutter speed. Your camera has a shutter inside that blocks the sensor from receiving light. Every time you click the button on your camera, the shutter opens and closes and bam, you just took a photo. If the shutter stays open for longer, then your sensor has more time to receive light. If the shutter, however, snaps shut quickly, then your sensor has less time to receive light. We measure this speed in fractions of a second. For example, 1/1000th of a second is a fast shutter speed. This means less light and a darker image. 1/10th of a second, however, is a slow shutter speed, so all things equal, you get more light and a brighter image. Every time you double or halve the shutter speed, for example, so let's say we're going from 1/200th of a second to 1/100th of a second, you are changing the light by 1 stop. The only other thing you need to understand right now is that a fast shutter speed is used to capture faster moving subjects. As a rule, if you're shooting something like wildlife or sports photography, you'll probably want a faster shutter speed. If you're shooting landscapes though, or portraits, you can probably get away with a slower shutter speed. Okay, let's put it into practice. Say a subject walks past your camera at 1/1000th of a second. Your sensor is only getting a very quick glimpse of them. That means you're more likely to freeze them in place for a sharp, detailed image. At 1/10th of a second though, your sensor is exposed for much longer, meaning that if your subject is moving in that time, they will be moving across the sensor and there will be visible motion or blur in your final image. If you want to make sure your pictures are crisp at all times, a great place to start is by taking the focal length of the lens that you're shooting and doubling it. For example, on a 50mm lens, try and keep your shutter speed above 1/100th of a second. Next we have our aperture. Very simply, your aperture is the iris or opening at the back of the lens that lets light pass through. It's shown on your camera as a number with an F before it. A low number corresponds to a wide open aperture. This means a lot of light can come in through the back of the lens. A high number means a closed aperture, and that means you're letting less light pass into your camera. One more thing, the wider the aperture, the more blurry your background will get. We call this a shallow depth of field because only a very small part of the image is in sharp focus. This is good for things like shooting portraits of 1 or 2 people. You can probably guess where this is going next. The smaller the aperture, which is a higher number, means the more depth of field that you'll have. This is good for something like landscape photography where you need everything in focus from the foreground to the background. Now for ISO or ISO. This controls how sensitive your camera is to light. A higher number means more sensitive and a lower number means less sensitive. In general, we try and keep this number as low as we can because a lower ISO will mean a cleaner looking image. Here are 2 examples. The first image was shot as ISO 100 and the second image was shot at ISO 6400. Have a look at the grain or the digital noise that appears on the second one. This is usually the last thing that we would change if we have the choice. It's a completely digital function and it basically means we're not actually getting any more light in our image. It's the photography equivalent of basically turning up the volume in post. That being said, don't be afraid to use it as needed. Modern cameras now are very good at handling low light in most situations. Okay, let's recap quickly before we put it all together. I've made a PDF that summarizes this whole video. If you would ever like to go back and refer to something or just keep it on your phone as a reference, you can find it in the link below. So, exposure is measured in stops. It's made up of 3 main components. Say it with me, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Shutter speed is how long your sensor sees the light and will determine if your subject is frozen or blurred. Aperture is the size of the hole in your lens letting in light. It will control the amount of your image that's in focus. ISO is the sensitivity that your camera has to light. The higher you push it, the more grain you will see in your final image. Adding a stop in any of these settings doubles the amount of light that you'll see in your exposure, and removing a stop will halve it. So how do you actually pick the right settings? There's no right or wrong, but the best way to learn, in my opinion, is to start by switching your camera to manual or M mode. When you look at your camera's LCD screen or viewfinder, there will be either a number or a scale that looks something like this. This is your meter, which is your camera's interpretation of what a correct exposure is. It's actually very easy to read. A value of 0 is balanced, -1 is 1 stop underexposed, +1 is 1 stop overexposed, etc, etc. As you start to pick your settings, watch as this value changes. Don't use it as gospel, but it's a really good place to start. So here's how I would do it. Number 1, start with your base ISO, usually around 100. Number 2, select your aperture based on how much of the image you want in focus. I'm taking a photo of one person here, so I'm going to go for f2.8 to f3.5. Number 3, dial in your shutter speed until you are on or close to 0 on your camera speeder. Now, are your images blurry because your shutter speed is too low? Increase your shutter speed. Are your images too dark now? Increase your ISO. Do you need more of your image in focus? Increase your aperture. Above all, a photographer is a problem solver. Once you take a shot, ask yourself, what can I do to make this look better? You now have all the tools at your disposal to do exactly this. Congratulations, you just became a photographer.